True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed them, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in heaven and in earth. I heard many things in hell. How, then, am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point, you fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it. Oh, so gently. And then, when I made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Thus begins The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, one of the widest known and longest enduring stories of the American English canon. Edgar Allan Poe, who died rather mysteriously and broke in October 3rd of 1849, remains one of the best known names in American literature. From Wikipedia, we get this on his death, quote, "On October 3rd, 1849, Poe was found semi-conscious in Baltimore, quote, in great distress and in need of immediate assistance," end quote. According to Joseph W. Walker, who found him, he was taken to the Washington Medical College, where he died on Sunday, October 7th, 1849, at 5 o'clock in the morning. Poe was not coherent long enough to explain how he came to be in his dire condition and why he was wearing the clothes that were not his own. He is said to have repeatedly called out the name Reynolds on the night before his death, though it is unclear to whom he was referring. His attending physician said that Poe's final words were, quote, "Lord help my poor soul," end quote. All of the relevant medical records have been lost, including Poe's death certificate, end quote. So mysterious and foreboding and possibly fitting, and admittedly even mesmerizing, was this death in comparison to his work, that the man himself has become something of an American icon. The mystery and macabre surrounding that icon is so great that it has spawned progeny of its own. The Poe toaster, again from Wikipedia, quote, between 1949 and 2009, a bottle of cognac and 3 roses were left at Poe's original grave marker every January 19th by an unknown visitor affectionately referred to as the Poe toaster. Sam Porpora was a historian at the Westminster Church in Baltimore, where Poe is buried. He claimed on August 15, 2007, that he had started the tradition in 1949. Porpora said that the tradition began in order to raise money and enhance the profile of the church. His story has not been confirmed, and some details which he gave to the press are factually inaccurate. The Poe toaster's last appearance was on January 19, 2009, the day of Poe's bicentennial. End quote. But why has Edgar Allan Poe lived for so long in the American consciousness? For that, we have to turn to the greater human consciousness. Why do we read horror stories? Why do we love the macabre? Why are we so smitten with the scary? Considering that the modern master of horror, Stephen King, has sold over 350 million books, this question seems ever relevant. So, for the answer, maybe we should turn to Stephen King for a little bit of his insight. In his 1981 treatise on the horror genre, Stephen King says this, quote, because I am a horror novelist and also a child of my times, and because I believe that horror does not horrify unless the reader or viewer has been personally touched, you will find the autobiographical element constantly creeping in. Horror in real life is an emotion that one grapples with, as I grappled with the realization that the Russians had beaten us to space, all alone. It is a combat waged in the secret recesses of the heart. I believe that we are all ultimately alone, and that any deep and lasting human contact is nothing more or less than a necessary illusion. But at least the feelings which we think of as positive and constructive are a reaching out, an effort to make contact and establish some sort of communication. Feelings of love and kindness, the ability to care and empathize, are all we know of the light. They are efforts to link and integrate. They are the emotions which bring us together, if not, in fact, then, at least in a comforting illusion that makes the burden of mortality a little easier to bear. Horror, terror, fear, panic, these are the emotions which drive wedges between us, split us off from the crowd, and make us alone. It is paradoxical that feelings and emotions we associate with the mob instinct should do this, but crowds are lonely places to be. We are told, a fellowship with no love in it. The melodies of the horror tale are simple and repetitive, and they are melodies of disestablishment and disintegration. But another paradox is that the ritual outletting of these emotions seems to bring things back to a more stable and constructive state again. Ask any psychiatrist what his patient is doing when he lies there on the couch and talks about what keeps him awake and what he sees in his dreams. What do you see when you turn out the light? The Beatles asked. Their answer? I can't tell you, but I know that it's mine. The genre we're talking about, whether it be in terms of books, film, or TV, is really all one. Make-believe horrors. And one of the questions that frequently comes up, asked by people who have grasped the paradox but perhaps not fully articulated it in their own minds, is, Why do you want to make up horrible things when there is so much real horror in the world? The answer seems to be that we make up horrors to help us cope with the real ones. With the endless inventiveness of humankind, we grasp the very elements which are so divisive and destruction and try to turn them into tools, to dismantle themselves. The term catharsis is as old as Greek drama, and it has been used rather too glibly by some practitioners in my field to justify what they do, but it still has its limited uses here. The dream of horror is in itself an outletting and a lancing. And it may well be that the mass media dream of horror can sometimes become a nationwide analyst's couch. So, for the final time before we push on, October of 1957, now, as absurd as it looks on the face of it, Earth versus the flying saucer has become a symbolic political statement. Below its pulpy invaders from space storyline, it becomes a preview of the ultimate war. Those greedy, twisted old monster piloting... I don't know how I did that. Those greedy, twisted old monsters piloting the saucers are really the Russians. The destruction of the Washington Monument, the Capitol Dome, and the Supreme Court, all rendered with graphic, eerie believability by Harryhausen's stop-motion effects, becomes nothing less than the destruction one would logically expect when the A-bombs finally fly. And then the end of the movie comes. The last saucer has been shot down by Hugh Marlowe's secret weapon, an ultrasonic gun that interrupts the electromagnetic drive of the flying saucers, or some sort of agreeable foolishness. Loudspeakers blare from every Washington corner, seemingly. The present danger is over. The present danger is over. The present danger is over. The camera shows us clear skies. The evil old monsters with their frozen snarls and their twisted root faces have been vanquished. We cut to a California beach magically deserted except for Hugh Marlowe and his new wife, who is, of course, the daughter of the crusty old military man who died for his country. They are on their honeymoon. "Russ," she asks him, "will they ever come back?" Marlowe looks sagely up at the sky, then back at his wife. "Not on such a pretty day," he says comfortingly, "and not to such a nice world." They run hand in hand into the surf, and the end credits roll. For a moment, just a moment, the paradoxical trick has worked. We have taken horror in hand and used it to destroy itself, a trick akin to pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps. For a little while, the deeper fear, the reality of the Russian Sputnik and what it means, has been excised. It will grow back again, but that is for later. For now, the worst has been faced, and it wasn't so bad after all. There was that magic moment of reintegration and safety at the end, the same feeling that comes when the roller coaster stops at the end of its run and you get off with your best girl, both of you whole and unhurt. I believe it's this feeling of reintegration, arising from a field specializing in death, fear, and monstrosity, that makes the danse macabre so rewarding and magical. That, and the boundless ability of the human imagination to create endless dream worlds and then put them to work. It is a world which a fine poet such as Anne Sexton was able to use to write herself sane. From her poems expressing and delineating her descent into the maelstrom of insanity, her own ability to cope with the world eventually returned, at least for a while. And perhaps others have been able to use her poems in their turn. This is not to suggest that writing must be justified on the basis of its usefulness. To simply delight the reader is enough, isn't it? This is a world I've lived in by my own choosing since I was a kid, since long before the Stratford Theater and Sputnik 1. I am certainly not trying to tell you that the Russians traumatized me into an interest of horror fiction, but I am simply pointing out that instant when I began to sense a useful connection between the world of fantasy and that of what my weekly reader used to call current events. End quote. So what we get from Stephen King there is this idea that being afraid is an emotion which drives us apart. As Yoda would have us know, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. But Stephen King is making the argument that real fear does this, while and whereas perhaps literary fear, fear from reading or watching movies or television, as he is so quick to point out, these types of manufactured and fake fear may be an attempt to make that fear ubiquitous, to make it universal. To take the fear of a real thing, as Stephen King had mentioned in Danse Macabre, sitting in a theater when the theater owner came in, brought the lights up, and said, "Hey, the Russians have gone to space. The Russians have put Sputnik 1 into orbit. We don't know where it's at, but maybe it's looking at us. Maybe they're listening to us." That is what the fear was. We fictionalize that fear into little green men coming to us by spacecraft, and it could smooth over that fear, rub that fear cleanly across the top of all of us into his example of a movie whereby we can all feel that type of fear together and excise it, and have those feelings together as opposed to alone. Have those feelings together and strong as opposed to lonely and vulnerable. That seems to be some modicum of what it is that Stephen King feels that horror does for us. But is that the all of it? In a 2015 article from The Guardian written by Lou Morgan, we get the following, quote, "Fear is one of our primal emotions. It's one that is hardwired into us, just as it is in all animals. On a very basic level, it has kept us alive as a species, encouraging us to stay away from the long drops and big fires, helping us to dodge saber-toothed tigers and other things with big sharp teeth and claws that might quite enjoy adding us to their dinner. Last time I looked, though, there weren't too many saber-toothed tigers to worry about on my local street. We're a peculiar lot, when you think about it. We work so hard to make our world, our environments, safer. And then we actively seek out things that will make us afraid. Horror movies, urban legends, ghost stories. We hunt down the darkness and we revel in it. Why? Because this way we can control it. Abandonment, helplessness, pain, loss, and grief. These are the big things that frighten us, the things we think could destroy us. These are the things that keep us up at night. These are the new saber-toothed tigers. The difference is that if you're faced with a saber-toothed tiger, a spear is going to make you feel a whole lot better about your odds of survival. How do we battle the fear of losing the people we love and being powerless to stop it? How do we face that down? Simple. We seek out stories which give us a place to put our fears. Horror stories reflect their times. Just as the repressed Victorians loved their vampires, we seem to gravitate towards technology, zombies, dystopia, psychological terrors. When I wrote my own horror novel, Sleepless, I wanted to add the intense pressures and stresses of exams into that mix, and particularly as someone with a long, slightly embattled history of manic depression, the fear of not being able to trust your own mind. We're curious about fear. Some of us have phobias we can't explain. Some of us cheerfully admit to being frightened of public speaking, snakes, or heights. The top 3 British fears, according to a 2014 YouGov poll. But when it comes down to it, we don't want real fear in our lives. We don't know what to do with it. In some cases, we can't do anything about the things we're afraid of anyway. In others, we could. But at what cost? End quote. I'm going to differ slightly from both of these answers. I think there is a great big deal of fear, but I will work up to my own answer a bit more slowly. I will start, as I often do, with literature. In How to Read and Why, Harold Bloom states, quote, "Ultimately, we read in order to strengthen the self and to learn its authentic interests. We experience such augmentations as pleasure, which may be why aesthetic values have always been deprecated by social moralists from Plato through our current campus Puritans. The pleasures of reading indeed are selfish rather than social. You cannot directly improve anyone else's life by reading better or more deeply. I remain skeptical of the traditional social hope that care for others may be stimulated by the growth of individual imaginations, and I am wary of any arguments whatsoever that connect the pleasures of solitary reading to the public good." End quote. And though I love Harold Bloom unabashedly, I disagree with this, or rather, I think, if I may use a cliche that for which Harold Bloom would smite me, I think in this quote, Harold Bloom stops short. Harold Bloom believes, or does not believe, I guess I should say, that reading should be a part of the individual in order that the individual be more of a, quote, public good, end quote. But what is the public if not a collection of individuals? And if reading does strengthen the individual, the more readers there are in any public, in any society, the stronger that society will be, and thus the public good will be accumulated. The knowledge of the self gained from, for example, The Walking Dead, the strengthening of the self from that text is not the survivalistic mechanism in those comics, though there may be some good to do with that as well. No, the real understanding that comes with stories such as that is that the real evil will not be the big bad. It will not be from the zombie horde. The real bad guy in The Walking Dead are other people. But that is a specific example. That is not the greater good of what it means to read horror. That is not the big idea behind why so many people love scary stories. It couldn't be. That is something smaller. That individual example is something of a tactic on the battlefield of literature where strategy has to reign supreme, but even the tactic of The Walking Dead on the battlefield of literature is not the overarching mission statement. And if these scary stories, if the horror genre is part of the mission statement, the stated goal of fully expressing the human experience, we have to go back to what it means to be human. Some of our oldest stories and traditions can be described as nothing short of horror. In fact, these horrific ideas go all the way back to our stories of origin. In Genesis, we get, quote, "And the human knew Eve and his woman, and she conceived and bore Cain. And she said, I have got me a man with the Lord. And she bore as well his brother Abel, and Abel became a herder of sheep, while Cain was a tiller of soil. And it happened in the course of time that Cain brought from the fruit of the soil an offering to the Lord. And Abel too had brought from his choice firstlings of his flock. And the Lord regarded Abel and his offerings, but did not regard Cain and his offerings. And Cain was very incensed, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you incensed? And why is your face fallen? For whether you offer well or whether you do not, at the tent flap sin crouches, and for you it is longing, but you will rule over it. And Cain said to Abel his brother, Let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose against Abel his brother, and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the soil. And so cursed shall you be by the soil that gaped with its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. And if you till the soil, it will no longer give you strength. A restless wanderer shall you be on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is too great to bear. Now that you have driven me this day from the soil, I must hide from your presence. I shall be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, Therefore whoever kills Cain shall suffer sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, so that whosoever found him would not slay him. And Cain went out from the Lord's presence and dwelled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and conceived, and bore Enoch. Then he became the builder of a city, and he called the name of the city like his son's name, Enoch. We have there in Genesis not just a story of murder, which what could be more horrific than that, but a murder by a family member. And then we have, as Stephen King called out, that idea of separation being horrific. Cain is cast out east of Eden. We can even go to the English tradition. We could start with, say, Beowulf. Beowulf has to fight the monster Grendel. Grendel being a monster described as such in Seamus Heaney's translation. Quote, every nail, claw, scale, and spur, every spike and welt on that hand of that heathen brute was barbed steel. Everybody said there was no honed iron hard enough to pierce him through, no time-proofed blade that could cut his brutal blood-caked claw. End quote. Guys, that's a monster if ever I have heard one described. In fact, Tolkien's translation of the story has this describing Grendel, quote, the other miscreated thing in man's form trod the ways of exile, albeit he was greater than any other human thing. Him in days of old the dwellers on earth named Grendel. End quote. Sure, Beowulf is a very old example of the hero's journey, but he is partaking in that hero's journey to slaughter a monster. Beowulf is thought to have been first written down between 700 and 1000, the years 700 and 1000, though the oral tradition of this story goes back who knows how many eons. All the way back to Greek mythology, we have Medusa, we have the Minotaur, we have the Hydra, the Chimera, Cerberus, my personal favorite, the Harpies, and even Impusa, who I think I've run into several times in my life. These literary creations are not just villains. They're not just the bad guys. They are something more. And from an American perspective, we can even look at what is probably the second most popular holiday, Halloween, stemming probably from All Saints' Eve, dating back to at least the year 609. It seems that the need for fear is deeply rooted within us. And in a world of ever more esoteric fears, we still have to have it. We need fear. We need to feel it, like joy, like we need to laugh, the same way we sometimes just need a hug. The way, perhaps, that once sexuality is awakened within us, we will always yearn for a sensual touch. We have all awakened to fear. Our first moments in life were terrifying. From the warmth and relative comfort of our mother's womb, we are thrust into reality. Or, as Christopher Hitchens said, you're expelled from your mother's uterus as if shot from a cannon towards a barn door studded with old nail files and rusty hooks. We may not remember it, but probably fear was the first emotion we really felt. All of us. And therefore it is possibly not just a human emotion, but I would contend that it is the original human emotion. We knew it before we even particularly partook in consciousness. I think we need that feeling of fear, and with fictions, it is immediately triggerable. The same way that the animal part of us needs exercise, and so we have created gyms, because no longer do we have to hunt for food. In order that we can more fully know all of our feelings and emotions, all of our mental states, we need the feeling of fear. And like a treadmill, we can pull up our favorite scary story and give it a whirl. That is all I have for this episode. If you like or appreciate what I am doing here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button in order to stick around for more. I hope to have you back for the next one.